And in that silence, the shadow of one man looms larger than ever, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. For 2 decades, Lavrov was the mirror of Moscow's confidence, the proof that loyalty could outlast chaos. The Kremlin has turned its gaze inward, and its own reflection terrifies it. Reports whisper of panic behind the marble walls, of meetings canceled, of orders rewritten, of fear replacing faith. It is the tremor before a collapse, the moment when power begins to devour itself. The empire that once conquered others now eats its own. Stay with us, because this is not just a story but a strategic perspective that impacts global politics. Join us and accompany us so that hot issues and historic decisions can be spread. For 21 years, Sergei Lavrov stood at the right hand of Vladimir Putin, the unshakable pillar of Russian diplomacy, the polished voice of the Kremlin abroad. He was the man who could turn confrontation into calm, who carried Moscow's defiance with the discipline of an old soldier. Yet in the winter of 2025, that loyalty became his curse. It began with a phone call, a call that should have changed history but instead ignited a purge. When Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin spoke to Donald Trump that morning, he expected a negotiation, perhaps even a revival of old understandings. The discussion was said to concern a summit in Budapest, a possible path toward peace in Ukraine. The call was courteous, polite, measured. But when the line went dead, so too did the illusion that Russia still held leverage. Hours later, Lavrov drafted his letter to Washington, a list of demands dressed in diplomatic phrases. He wrote of territorial concessions, of security guarantees, of Ukraine's neutrality, and the end of NATO's eastward gaze. He was certain it was what the president wanted. But in Washington, the response was immediate and brutal. The proposal was dismissed as nothing more than surrender written in silk. Within days, sanctions fell like hammer blows. 2 of Russia's largest oil companies were blacklisted entirely. Tankers were stranded at sea. Payments froze. Traders fled. And deep inside the Kremlin, panic crept quietly down its corridors. Putin watched the numbers collapse, the ruble stumble, the headlines turn. He saw betrayal not in the West, but in the faces around him. Lavrov's letter had failed. His calmness, once praised, now looked like weakness. His careful words, once diplomatic, now seemed deceitful. And in that feverish atmosphere, failure became treason. State television shifted overnight. Lavrov's speeches vanished from archives. His image faded from broadcasts. Editing errors, they said. But everyone knew. The purge had begun. The president's circle, once impenetrable, was tightening. The walls of loyalty were closing in. Lavrov himself had not been seen for weeks. His chair was empty during the Security Council's most crucial meeting, the one where Putin spoke of nuclear readiness and destiny. For the first time in 20 years, the foreign minister of Russia was absent. In Moscow, that silence spoke louder than any speech. Those who served alongside him understood the code. When your name disappears from state television, your future disappears with it. And yet this was not the story of a man alone. It was the story of a system devouring its architects. Inside Russia, whispers spread among officials. If Lavrov can fall, one aide was heard saying, then none of us are safe. The same hands that had signed treaties, the same voices that had defended Russia on global stages, now trembled over phones, waiting for instructions that might never come. Foreign observers called it paranoia. Russians called it survival. The Kremlin has always lived on fear. It is its language, its rhythm, its oxygen. From the czars to the commissars, the rule has never changed. When the empire weakens, the purge begins. For Lavrov, the irony was cruel. He had built his career defending Putin's world, a world of controlled order, of discipline disguised as unity. But as the war dragged on, as sanctions bit deeper, even that illusion cracked. His loyalty, his caution, his decades of service could not save him from becoming the perfect scapegoat. One Western diplomat described it bluntly: Putin cannot blame himself, so he blames his shadow. In the Kremlin's corridors, portraits are not hung for honor. They are hung to remind others how replaceable they are. Lavrov's portrait is gone now, replaced by silence, by the whisper that even the loyal must fall when power begins to rot from within. Russia, or Rusia, as its people call her with a sigh of pride and fatigue, has seen this pattern before. When the crown trembles, the courtiers pay. When one man's survival defines a nation, every loyalist becomes a threat. And as Moscow's snow falls heavier this year, the story of Sergei Lavrov stands as both warning and prophecy, that in a system ruled by fear, devotion is not protection. It is an invitation to disappear. Long before the Kremlin's marble corridors echoed with whispers of betrayal, Russia had learned an ancient trick, a myth as old as its monarchy. It was called the good Tsar, bad Boyar story. When times grew dark, when wars were lost or bread ran out, the ruler remained innocent. It was always the ministers, the courtiers, the schemers who had failed him. The Tsar stayed pure, the people stayed loyal, and the guilty were fed to the fire. In 2025, Vladimir Putin has revived that same mythology, not by accident but by design. After Lavrov's disappearance, state television did not simply fall silent, it began to sing a new refrain. Anchors spoke gravely of lazy officials and corrupt ministers. The problem, they said, was not the president, but the system built weak in the 1990s. One presenter declared on air, "Our president is strong, but the state beneath him is fragile." Another nodded solemnly, warning that bureaucrats prefer to do nothing. They betray his orders. These were not slips of the tongue. They were signals, the kind that only those inside the Kremlin truly understand. It was, in essence, a ritual cleansing, political exorcism disguised as news. The same channels that once celebrated Lavrov now portrayed him as part of a rotting structure, a relic of a past that dared to question the Tsar. The narrative was clear. Russia was not failing because of Putin's decisions. It was failing because his servants had not been faithful enough. Such stories work because they appeal to something deep and familiar in the Russian soul, a yearning for a benevolent father figure betrayed by wicked advisors. History has seen it before. Ivan the Terrible's Oprichnina, Stalin's purges, Khrushchev's denunciations. Each time the same pattern: purge the men, preserve the myth. Western observers watch with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. How can one man command such loyalty in the face of so much ruin? The answer lies not in ideology but in psychology. Putin has turned fear into faith. By casting himself as the eternal victim of betrayal, he transforms weakness into sanctity. Every failure becomes proof of his righteousness. Inside Russia, however, the effect is suffocating. Civil servants now write reports not to inform but to survive. Generals issue commands no one will execute. Ministries move papers in circles, each waiting for another to make the fatal mistake first. It is government by paralysis, the tyranny of caution. And while fear grips the bureaucracy, the people are fed the old hymn of endurance. Trust the leader, the broadcasts murmur. He is blameless. He will save us once the traitors are gone. It is a lullaby of submission, played softly over images of missiles and marching soldiers. But beneath that music, something else stirs: exhaustion. The illusion of the strong man can comfort a nation for only so long before it begins to feel like a chain. In Moscow cafes, in half-empty train stations, in the quiet corners of provincial towns, the conversations are changing. People speak in riddles, in whispers, in jokes that are not really jokes. The myth is cracking. Perhaps that is why the propaganda has grown louder, to drown out the doubt. The louder they shout of loyalty, the more fragile the loyalty becomes. For now, the story holds. The Tsar is still good, the Boyars are still bad. But the faces on television look tired, their voices less certain. They know that when another disaster strikes, another lost city, another failed deal, another blackout, they might be next. This is not simply politics. It is a survival mechanism dressed in history's robes. The myth keeps the throne standing, even as the foundations crumble. Yet myths are brittle things. Once the people stop believing, they shatter. And what lies beneath is always the same: fear, hunger, and the long echo of silence. Power, when driven by fear, eventually turns against itself. And in Putin's Russia, or Rusia as its people affectionately call her, that moment has arrived. The grand machinery that once moved in perfect obedience now splits into two rival camps. One serves tradition, the other serves chaos. On one side stands the old guard, the propagandists, the generals, the ministers who built their careers under the iron calm of Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. They are the custodians of the myth, the keepers of the old order. For them, stability is faith, and the president's words are scripture. They whisper of patience, of endurance, of eventual triumph. On the other side rise the Z-bloggers, the fiery nationalists born from the internet's shadows, men with millions of followers and no restraint. They once cheered Putin's war. They called it holy, inevitable, redemptive. But now they accuse him of weakness, of half measures, of being too cautious to finish what he started. They demand annihilation, not negotiation. In their broadcasts, they call for Ukraine to be erased entirely, for history to be rewritten in blood. Between these two forces, Putin stands alone, not as a mediator, but as the axis around which every ambition spins. The old guard fears the chaos the Z-bloggers could unleash. The Z-bloggers mock the stagnation of the old guard. Both claim to serve the same leader, yet both secretly dread what he might do next. The Kremlin, once a single heart of power, has become a house divided by mirrors. Everyone sees themselves reflected, loyal, necessary, irreplaceable, until the glass breaks. Whispers inside Moscow describe meetings filled with silence, where even breathing too loudly feels like dissent. Officials glance over their shoulders, unsure whether the next accusation will come from a rival or from the president himself. The purges no longer move downward, they move sideways. Colleagues denounce colleagues. Allies test each other's loyalty with cautious smiles and coded words. And Putin watches always. To him, every quarrel is proof of his control. Divide, exhaust, and rule. That has been the art of the Kremlin since the days of the Tsars. But this time the divisions are deeper. They are ideological, generational, spiritual. The war in Ukraine was meant to unite the nation. Instead, it has opened wounds too wide to close. The old guard looks backward toward empire and pride. The Z-bloggers look forward, but to a future soaked in vengeance. Neither path leads to peace. Both lead to the same end: isolation, suspicion, decay. When one listens carefully to state media, a new tension hums beneath the surface. Words like discipline and order are repeated with desperate insistence. It is the language of a system that no longer trusts itself. Across the country, those who once mocked dissenters now whisper in private. Even the fiercest patriots understand that when the purge begins, ideology offers no protection. You can be loyal today and erase tomorrow. If you care about this issue, which affects politics, please say amen in the comments below. The latest news from Russia is no longer written in headlines. It is written in absences. The officials who vanish, the voices that go quiet, the chairs that remain empty. And yet amid the fear, something strange happens. Defiance turns inward. Some of the younger bureaucrats, weary of performing loyalty, begin to joke quietly about the phantom loyalty test. They know that no oath, no public devotion can guarantee safety. In the Kremlin's history, paranoia has always been the final stage of power. It is what consumed Ivan the Terrible, what haunted Stalin in his final days. And now it creeps again through Rusia's veins. The factions fight, but the outcome is already written. There is no victory in this war within, only survivors waiting for their turn. While the Kremlin feasts on loyalty and fear, the rest of Russia starves on silence. Beyond Moscow's palaces and military parades, a quieter disaster unfolds, one that no purge can erase. The numbers no longer lie. The economy, once the pride of Putin's stability, has begun to crumble like frostbitten stone. Factories hum slower. Freight trains stand idle. Markets whisper of shortages not seen since the final days of the Soviet Union. State television still praises resilience, but the faces behind the cameras know the truth. Inflation gnaws at wages. Prices rise like winter snow, soft, relentless, merciless. Official reports admit what used to be unthinkable. 1 in 3 major companies now operates at a loss. The transport sector falters, energy revenues shrink, and once proud giants of industry drown under sanctions. Russian railways, a lifeline of the nation, employing hundreds of thousands, predict a 6% fall in freight traffic next year. To outsiders, that may sound like a figure on paper. To those who depend on it, it means fewer jobs, emptier tables, colder homes. Pensioners, the same generation that once survived war and famine, now watch their life savings fade into meaningless numbers. Forecasts suggest that by 2026, the average pension will be barely a quarter of the average salary. Retirement no longer means rest, it means poverty prolonged. In provincial towns, queues form again, not for bread, but for medicine. Pharmacies ration supplies. Hospitals delay surgeries. Teachers take second jobs. Farmers trade goods privately to survive. It is the same silent barter of desperation that once defined the twilight years of the Soviet Empire. The government's solutions sound like echoes from another century. Parliament debates a cap on retail markups. 15%, they say, will control inflation. But with current markups reaching nearly 300% in some regions, such measures are fantasy. Economists warn that forced controls will only drive stores to close and black markets to bloom. Shortages, hoarding, empty shelves, the ghosts of 1989 return, wearing 21st century clothes. And through it all, the official narrative remains unwavering. We are strong. We will endure. Yet endurance without progress is not strength, it is paralysis. Putin's ministers insist that sanctions have failed, that Russia has adapted. But even adaptation has its limits. The trade routes to China and India, once hailed as salvation, cannot replace the global systems that have been lost. The ruble's fluctuations tell the story more honestly than any speech. Stability replaced by volatility, pride replaced by anxiety. The tragedy, however, is not only economic. It is moral. A nation that once sent rockets into space now measures victory in how slowly it collapses. The bright promise of modernization, of technology, industry, and opportunity fades beneath the weight of isolation. The sanctions were meant to punish. Instead, they have exposed the fragility that fear created. And still, state media find someone else to blame. The 90s built this weakness, they repeat. Western greed fuels the crisis. But the people know better. The pensioner counting coins, the mother skipping meals, the miner whose pay is late for the third month in a row, they all know the real culprit is not history but habit, the habit of silence. Russia's leaders claim they defend sovereignty. Yet what kind of sovereignty leaves its citizens hungry? What kind of strength hides from accountability? The empire that once dictated the price of oil now struggles to control the price of bread. It is an irony so heavy that even the propagandists struggle to bear it. Once Moscow dictated the rhythm of the world. Now it debates how much bread should cost. And somewhere behind those debates, the same question echoes again. The one whispered in every corridor of power, in every shop, in every home. Who's next? There comes a moment in every empire's life when its greatest threat is no longer foreign armies or distant revolutions, but the fear within its own walls. For Russia, that moment has come. Sergei Lavrov's disappearance was not an isolated act. It was a symptom of something far greater, the slow decay of a system built on silence. The purge that began with one minister has now become a doctrine. Each night, new names vanish from official websites. Advisors resign for health reasons. Governors are replaced without notice. The machinery of governance still turns, but every cog trembles. Inside the Kremlin, portraits hang heavy on the walls. Faces of men who once swore eternal loyalty now stare down like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their achievements erased. The corridors echo with a familiar refrain. The Tsar remains pure. The Boyars have failed him. Yet each repetition rings weaker, as if even the marble itself has grown weary of the lie. They told us Russia was strong. They told us unity was eternal. But we can see the cracks, widening, inevitable. Those who watch from afar might call it control. But to those inside, it feels like confinement. The same fear that keeps Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in power is the same fear that hollows out the state beneath him. Officials obey not from respect, but from dread. Institutions function not for progress, but for performance. Every speech, every gesture, every silence serves one purpose: to preserve the illusion that nothing has changed. Yet everything has. The world outside Russia watches this transformation with morbid fascination. Western analysts speak of sanctions and strategy, of oil and arms. But they often miss the deeper tragedy, the human erosion, the quiet collapse of trust. When truth becomes treason, when loyalty becomes dangerous, when silence becomes survival, a nation begins to eat itself from within. And yet, even in the darkest chambers of the Kremlin, there remain those who remember another Russia, one of poets, thinkers, and builders. A Russia that reached for the stars, not because it wanted to dominate, but because it believed it could inspire. That memory, faint and flickering, still burns in the hearts of its people. Among the older generation, those who survived the fall of the Soviet Union, there is both sorrow and clarity. They have seen this cycle before. They know that no leader, no matter how powerful, can escape history's verdict. Empires collapse not with explosions, but with whispers, whispers that grow into questions, and questions that grow into courage. For now, courage hides. It waits. But history has never favored fear for long. Across the vastness of Russia, from St. Petersburg's frozen canals to the fields of Omsk and the mountains of Dagestan, people whisper the same uncertain thought: if the loyal can fall, what of the rest of us? It is not rebellion yet, but it is no longer obedience either. It is the first crack of awakening. The empire that devours itself may still roar for a while, but every roar costs it another piece of its soul. Power that consumes loyalty becomes hollow. Loyalty that consumes conscience becomes blind. As night falls over Moscow's skyline, the question lingers once more, heavier now, unavoidable. Who's next? Because in the story of every autocracy, the end is written long before it arrives. And when the purge is complete, when the silence grows unbearable, what remains is not strength, but emptiness. Power built on fear can silence a nation, but it can never hold its soul. For years, Russia has stood as a mirror to the world, proud, wounded, defiant, a nation of strength haunted by its own shadows. And now, as the purge widens, as names vanish and history bends once more, the truth is impossible to ignore. What begins as control always ends as decay. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin once promised stability, dignity, greatness. For a time he delivered them. But every system that depends on one man's certainty eventually faces the moment when certainty becomes blindness. The latest news about Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin speaks not of triumph, but of tension, of loyalty tested, of fear turned inward. The empire that devours its own can never be whole. Yet even in decay there is revelation. For beneath the marble and the slogans, there remains the beating heart of a people who have endured far worse and survived. They remember the hunger of the 40s, the silence of the 70s, the collapse of the 90s. And they know that no darkness lasts forever. Perhaps that is where hope still lives, not in the palaces, but in the kitchens, not in the parades, but in the quiet prayers of those who refuse to forget what dignity once meant. The strength of Russia, of Rasa, call her by any name, has never been her rulers. It has always been her people. So as the world watches this chapter unfold, we are reminded of an eternal truth. Power fades, but conscience endures. Every empire that turns inward eventually meets the mirror it fears the most, its own reflection. The latest news about Vladimir Putin may fill the headlines, but history's deeper story is being written in whispers, in memories, and in hearts that still believe in renewal. If this story touches something in your heart, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak up, subscribe for stories and news to be spread. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.